Hello and welcome to our second online session. Today we're going to be focusing on culturally proficient coaching. But before we start, I just wanted to go over some of the information that you will need to complete this session and get credit for it. So just so you know, there are 2 video PowerPoints for the Culturally Proficient Coaching session. This video and then part 2. There is also a participant answer sheet that's been uploaded onto the Google Classroom. So I would recommend that you open that and complete it along with watching the video. And then there are also a couple of interactive forum prompts that you will need to complete, and there's in addition to that an article that needs to be read. One of the things that you will need to know is that during these videos I will be posing specific questions that will need to be answered on the participant answer sheet, but those questions won't be on the answer sheet in their entirety. So you'll need to watch the video so that you know what questions that you are actually answering. Also, the expectations in order for you to get credit for this are that your work reflects interaction with the materials and all of the videos and the articles that are on Google Classroom, that it is turned in, submitted in completion on time, and that if you have any questions about the content, that you contact me, and then if you have any questions during the reviewing process, that you contact the person who is reviewing you. So let's go ahead and get started. We're going to start with the question, what is cultural competence? If we're looking to be culturally proficient coaches, then we need to look at what does it mean to be culturally competent. So as we watch this video that's coming up, think about the content of the video through 2 lenses, as both a teacher and as a coach, and then consider what role might cultural competence play in the coaching relationship.
Educators, I think, have an ethical responsibility to deeply understand the young people with whom they work. I think that if you are teaching someone's child, in some way you need to know the family, you need to know something about the neighborhood in which the child resides. You need to understand the variety of both challenges and opportunities that are part of that child's life, because what it does is to give you a kind of repertoire of possibilities in terms of how you can connect with kids. I think it's really important that educators are culturally competent because the diversity of our children now is greatly increased. In Hawaii, for example, there are no majorities. Everybody's a minority. Even within our own cultural groups, let's say ethnic Japanese, where they're 26%, depending upon the background that they come from, the generation that people immigrated, there is difference within each so-called category. So there is really no way for a teacher to assume that just knowing that most of the kids are going to be a particular ethnicity, there's going to be a certain way to teach.
So to me, cultural competence implies a certain grounding in the social relations of local communities, so that you not only get to know the community a little bit better firsthand, but that you give yourself plenty of opportunities to learn from others.
Cultural competence is creating a context that will honor students' culture, students' way of looking at the world, their value systems. And for teachers in a classroom, it's creating an environment that's safe, that will allow students to be who they are.
first question everyone who wants to be culturally competent as an educator should know how to ask themselves and also the young people that they work with is, tell me what it is that you're expert in. And it's that sharing of expertise and learning that enables us to think of cultural competence as this ability to navigate, negotiate, and mediate all the rapid changes and the diversities in every sort.
I think it's a special competency that teachers need as part of what I want to call, again, the moral obligations entailed in teaching. And the moral dimension of that work is if I want to have impact in terms of my teaching, then I have to come to know the community, the families, where I would be working.
As our communities change and evolve, as our children become different in relation to the circumstances, as society changes, educators need to be culturally competent because it's morally right, it's ethically right, and it's a matter of justice.
The basis of teaching and learning is social relation, so that being able to expand our ways of interacting and engaging others, I think, is central to a sound pedagogy in the contemporary schools.
I think the student achievement gaps are accompanied by other kinds of gaps. There are gaps in teacher knowledge, performance. There are gaps in the relationship between schools and communities. So NEA has an opportunity to call attention to these ways in which education can do more and be more for our local communities and for the nation.
The gap has to do with the misunderstanding of different ways of looking at the world, of different explanations, of different ways of, conceiving content. And the more we inform and educate our teachers, our leaders, everyone across the board about what some of these distinctions are, and they get worked into the curricula and they get worked into the preparation and ongoing professional development of teachers, then we'll have the opportunity to ensure that the gaps will be closed.
One of the things we know is that the young people who come from some of the most under-resourced communities can respond when they're asked to step up to the line and show what their achievements are. You're very, very strong in drawing, you're very strong in visual development, you're very strong in reading the text and the illustrations in the science book, but your achievement gap, as we now define it in education, is coming when I ask you to write a paragraph, and you simply don't want to do that. So let's think about adding to your achievements and making those achievements that you already
All right. So I'd like you to think about, how does this idea of cultural competence translate into the coaching relationship? The video was talking about classrooms and teachers with students, but how do we take that information and apply it through the lens of coaching? And then what role might cultural competence play in the coaching relationship? So you're going to take a moment and pause this video and go to page 1 on your participant answer sheet and answer these questions, and then also on Google Forum share the answer to what is a coaching or personal experience you had where cultural competence played a role. So please pause this video and write in your answer sheet and share the answer on Google Forum. So now we're going to take a look at cultural competence in the coaching context. And as we've been doing with all of the Coaching Institute pieces, is that we're looking at all of these topics through two different lenses, because you are both a coach and a teacher. So as we look at cultural competence through the teaching lens, we ask the questions: what does cultural competence look like in the classroom? Who benefits when you as a teacher are culturally competent? And how is this beneficial when you as a teacher are culturally competent? Then, as we go to this coaching lens, how might this competence be used in coaching as you work with other professionals? And in what ways is it beneficial to the coaching relationship for you to be culturally competent and for the person whom you are coaching to be culturally competent? So what we're going to really look at then, what is this idea of culture? Because there are a lot of ways that people define culture, and we want to make sure that we are on the same page. So what is culture? Culture, then, according to Cross et al., culture is an integrated pattern of human behavior that includes the way that we think, the way that we communicate, the actions based on those thoughts and communications, our customs, beliefs, values, and institutions of racial, ethnic, religious, or social groups. So for some, culture and the components that define culture are really easy to identify. But for others, they may have difficulty defining their own culture or even recognizing how those cultural components impact their interactions and relationships with others. So if you're in the second category, if you're having difficulty defining, what your culture is, or even what the components of that culture is and how those components might interact with others and with your relationships with other people, then I highly recommend books written by Robin DiAngelo. And her books are outlined or listed on a resource page that is in this Google Classroom. So I highly recommend that you read her books, because they will really illuminate culture and those cultural components for those of you who may have difficulty recognizing those. So in order to become culturally competent, you need to understand your culture and the cultures of others. So in some of our other professional development series, within this coaching series, we've talked about both macro and micro cultures. And so just to review what that means is a microculture are those typically larger cultural groups that we are born into or that are very intrinsically connected to who we are. They're almost non-choices. So our ethnicity, the content or a country in which we've been born into, and then those umbrella religions that we might identify with. Those are your macro cultures. Your microcultures then tend to be those subcultures that we identify with. So it might be teaching. Teachers are a microculture, or professions are a microculture. And they can be both ethnically based or non-ethnically based. So think about some of the cultural components that define you. And then I'd like you to consider how these components might affect your thoughts, perceptions, and or behaviors. and then stop the video again and write your answer on the first section of page 2. All right. So in order for us to become culturally competent, we first need to define competence. So what is competence? What does it mean that you are competent in a particular area? Well, the definition of competence is basically having the capacity to function effectively. So when we take that idea or concept and we look at it through a cultural lens, then we understand that cultural competence is the ability to interact effectively with people of different cultures, both macro cultures and microcultures. But in order to understand that, we have to understand the role of culture and what it means to different people. So culture plays a very pervasive role, and in fact, in my university courses that I teach, I tell my students that culture affects everything. It affects everything. It affects your access to critical resources such as safe housing, healthful food, and police protection. It affects your access or lack of access to formal academic language, to people in positions of power in corporates and through businesses, and just through who you know, because we all understand and recognize that who you know sometimes has a lot more power than what you know. It provides access to, or the lack of it, to highly trained, effective teachers and schools with competitive resources and support. And we see that not only in different areas geographically across our nation, but we also see that within our schools in LAUSD. It plays a role in the possession of social and cultural capital that is recognized and valued by the dominant culture. So those social pieces and what is socially acceptable, and then cultural capital really talks about, what cultural aspects are recognized as valuable by dominant culture. It also affects how your group's language is perceived, how your communication styles are perceived or recognized, behavioral norms, what is okay to do and not okay to do in different contexts. How loud are you talking? How are you interacting? Your eye contact and your nonverbal communications, the way that you express yourself, the way that you look, your aesthetics, holidays that you celebrate, traditions that you celebrate, and your belief systems are all perceived based on culture as either a deficit or as normalized. Culture also affects the experiences that people have with others who are in positions of authority, like the experiences that we have with teachers or had growing up with teachers or administrators, the experiences that we have or had with business owners or with law enforcement or court systems. These experiences can be positive or negative based on our culture and how we are perceived individually. It also affects how we are represented by people in positions of power and influence. In most of our schools across the nation, most of our educators, over 82% of our educators, are white women. what's our representation as far as politicians? We are beginning to see more women and more women of color in these positions, but who holds the most, the greater number? And then we need to keep in mind that those percentages have power, because everything is weighed out through votes. So if we don't have equal representation, then votes can easily be swayed. When we are pulled over by the police, what do those officers typically look like? What do our policymakers look like? What do the enforcers of policy look like? Who are our media icons and our Fortune 500 executives? So when we think about culture, we need to recognize inequity in representation and what that means when it comes to making decisions, and who those decision makers are, and what effects those have, what effects those decisions have. We also need to understand that culture affects media representations of those particular both macro and micro groups. And those representations are either blatantly positive and mostly positive, depending on the group that's being represented, or they are relentlessly negative. And we need to understand what those messages mean, and the effect that those messages have when they are played out over and over again in our media. Culture also affects our daily interactions with racism and discrimination. And for some groups, those are daily interactions versus the option. Other groups have the option to willfully ignore racism and discrimination or avoid inequity issues. So it's important to recognize that there are people who don't have those options to ignore that or avoid it, and there are people and groups that do. Culture affects assets, and how what we bring to the table is perceived as either an asset or a deficit. So our socioeconomic status, or the perception of our socioeconomic status based on our perception of the cultural or ethnic group that we may represent. How we are perceived as having the ability to afford or not afford things like nice cars, or to live in a good neighborhood, or to have nice things based on the way that we are once again perceived, or our cultural group or ethnic group is perceived. We are also judged on our intellectual competence, again, based on how we are perceived culturally and ethnically, or our morality, or our criminality. So those are all things that, again, people are either having to deal with on a day-to-day basis, or have the ability to ignore or avoid based on the way that they are perceived by others culturally or ethnically. So what are then the indicators of cultural competence? If we're going to be culturally competent, what does that look like? What do we need to have in place within ourselves to be culturally competent? Well, you are culturally competent if you are able to recognize the power and influence of culture, not just your culture, but other cultures. You're culturally competent if you recognize your own personal biases. And that personal biases cross all cultures, cross all academic and socioeconomic borders. Everyone has biases, period. It doesn't matter who you are, how educated you are, how well versed you are in crossing cultural lines. You have personal biases, period. If you are culturally competent, when you understand the ways in which socialization affects our responses to others, and you are culturally competent when you don't assume that all members of any particular group share the same beliefs and practices. Additionally, you are culturally competent when you can acknowledge that past, and when I speak of past, I mean historical past, especially within our country, how past experiences and how past actions affect present interactions. So our history is not over, and we do not need to get over it and move past it. We need to recognize the power of history and how it is still affecting what's happening today. Another indicator of cultural competence is recognizing that not everyone has the same opportunities in this country, and that understanding that when you are colorblind, when you say, I don't see color, color doesn't matter, I treat everyone the same, then in effect, what you are doing is you are ignoring all of the things that we just talked about. You're ignoring different experiences that people have, and you're also ignoring that people come from different backgrounds that have unique and special cultural characteristics that need to be recognized and celebrated, but that they also, based on those cultural backgrounds, have very different experiences that we must recognize if we are to be culturally competent. And then the final indicator of cultural competence is that we are able to build on the strengths and resources that of each culture, and we're able to pull that into relationships or pull that into the organizations in which we work, and really capitalize on that instead of diminishing people or seeing these as cultural deficits. So let's take a look at a cultural competence model, and I'd like you to look at this and really read these different levels of cultural competence, and then take a look at where you are in each of these pieces. All right, so when we take a look at this model, you first have to be aware of something before you can be competent in it. So it makes sense to start with the cultural awareness piece, looking at yourself, looking at what are my values, what do I believe, what do I think is normal, what are those ideas that, when I say, well, that's not normal, you have to understand that you are norming based on the way that you have been socialized. So what are my norms? What are the customs, traditions, biases, and stereotypes that I have? And what are the behaviors that I have based on all of these things? Who am I, and what are these pieces? then you need to look at people who are vastly different from yourself, or people with whom you have differing values, beliefs, norms, customs, and all of these things, and really look at that in detail. Then you move into that knowledge piece, and you recognize here, how are these pieces different, and what do I need to know and understand about different cultural groups. And again, when I say cultural, I mean both macro and micro, going beyond ethnic culture. And then once you have developed and built this knowledge, awareness, or understanding, when you have begun to do your research and to talk to different people and to go on the internet and to read some of the books that are recommended in the resource for this session, and really begin to understand some of these different experiences that people have, and how those experiences create the lens through which they see things and create their norms and the way that they look and the way that they behave. Then we move into this sensitivity piece, and we ask the question, are you open? Are you open to accepting that the way that you see things are not universal, that the way that your belief systems are not universal? And what are the benefits of looking at things through different lenses, and what might be some of the challenges that you would have to be able to do something as this? And as you learn more about other groups, then understanding that while we may still make snap judgments, how might I catch myself when I make a judgment? How might I remind myself that the way that I see things are very different than how others see things? And I believe that the only way to really develop this level of cultural sensitivity and move towards cultural competence is to understand the experiences of other groups in our country, and to understand what they have gone through historically and the things that other people continue to battle and endure in our country. And then we move into cultural competence, and really that looks at how we adjust the way that we think and then subsequently behave in order to operate in different cultural contexts. How can we move in effective ways between cultural groups and interact with people who think in very different ways and see the world in very different ways? So let's take a look then at cultural awareness. And I would like you to think about these questions. And these questions do come from Robin DiAngelo's work. How racially diverse was the neighborhood that you grew up in? What messages did you receive about race, culture, or ethnicity from your family, your friends, your schools, your neighbors, the neighborhood in which you grew up in, about race and ethnicity and culture? And then how have these things shaped your life now? So I'd like you to pause the video again and then answer these questions on page 2 in the middle section of page 2. Okay, now that you've answered these questions, let's go back to this idea that we all have biases and we all stereotype. And, I say this from I say this from a point of understanding that no matter how much education or how many experiences you have, that we still have these biases. Both my master's and doctoral work have been in social justice and in equity, and I've taught coursework on the university level for over 15 years focusing on this, and yet I still have biases and I still stereotype. So, really when we look at this, it begs for a question as to why. Why do we still? And the answer to that is socialization. So I'd like you to think about what are the social forces that contribute towards socialization. And what has happened, and what are we exposed to in our homes, in our neighborhoods and communities? What are we exposed to through mass media and social media? What are we exposed to in our K through 12 plus curriculum? And what about our interactions or experiences in all of the major institutions that we have to interact with within our lives in order to survive, like healthcare, the healthcare systems, or the justice systems, once again, our educational systems, and all large-scale industry in food, including food and drug administrations and essentially everything that we do. How does that impact our socialization? So it creates in us implicit bias. And these are attitudes, stereotypes, and beliefs that really truly can affect how we treat others. For the most part, implicit bias is not intentional, but it still impacts how we judge others based on factors such as race and ethnicity, ability, gender and gender identification, culture, and the language that we use. So we know through research that in early childhood settings, implicit biases can affect how we as educators perceive and respond to children, which then can lead to unfair practices in discipline, in expectations as to what students can accomplish, and then also suspensions and expulsions. And a couple of books that are excellent books in really showing how this plays out in our educational system are Bad Boys by Anne Ferguson. And then the second book is Push Out, The Criminalization of Black Girls in Schools, written by Monique Morris. So I highly recommend both of those books, and both of those books are on the resource book list. So as we look at this idea of cultural knowledge and the concept of culture, I really like this iceberg. And so take a moment and look at the iceberg and think about what stands out to you as you look at this iceberg. So I think, and in education, for some reason, we just love icebergs. When we look at the top, we look at all the things that you can't really get around when we think about this idea of culture. These are the things that we see, and that when somebody says, think about your culture, a lot of times we think about. But I'm also going to add to that, when we think about culture, a lot of times we also think about aesthetics, how somebody looks, and linguistics, how people speak. Because when we interact with people, We might not see the whole folk dancing piece or games or cooking or different types of food, but we definitely look at, and our first impressions of people from a cultural standpoint are most often based on the way that they look, their aesthetics, and the way that they speak, their linguistics. And then there are those pieces that are really out, generally speaking, out of our awareness. And those are all of those pieces that are below the surface, but that really do impact how we interact with other people. So I would like you to think about and jot down what stands out to you as you look at this iceberg, and then how might this impact the coaching relationship or a teacher's interaction with his or her students. So I'm going to ask you again to pause the video and answer the questions that I just posed on page 2 under Cultural Knowledge, the Iceberg section. So let me say those questions again. What stands out to you as you look at this iceberg? And then how might what you are looking at impact, how might this iceberg concept of culture impact you in a coaching relationship or a teacher as that teacher interacts with their students? So please pause. Okay, then the next thing that you're going to be doing is you're going to be looking at the pathway towards growing in cultural proficiency. And it has 4 different components. There are guiding principles to becoming more culturally proficient. There is a culturally proficient continuum. There are some essential elements of becoming culturally proficient. And then we're going to be looking at what are some of the barriers that we might come across on our way, on our path toward becoming more culturally proficient. So this is the end of this lecture, this part of the lecture. Each of those, as you get ready to explore this pathway, all of that is in your participant handout. So all of the information that you need is there, with the exception of one article, which you'll need to go into the Google Classroom to pull. But you'll be writing your answers on the participant handbook, and all of those pieces which require reflection are in the handbook. So with that, we are finished with part 1, or the first video lecture series for this session. Please go on to the pathway towards gaining and growing in cultural proficiency.